The rope creaked like old bones in the wind, and beneath it swayed a young woman in black, her feet barely touching the dusty earth below the gnarled oak tree. Jacob McCready had seen plenty of strange sights in his 32 years working this patch of Texas wilderness, but nothing quite like this. The woman wasn't dead. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but the wooden sign hanging around her neck made his blood run cold. God won't forgive the sins of my heart. He dismounted his horse with practiced silence, his weathered hands already reaching for the knife at his belt. The woman's habit was torn and dusty, her face pale as moonlight beneath the coarse brown hair that had escaped her wimple. She couldn't have been more than 25, far too young to be giving up on the Lord's mercy. "Easy there, sister," he murmured, cutting through the rope with one swift motion. She collapsed into his arms like a broken bird, and he felt the surprising warmth of her breath against his neck. "You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered open, the clearest green he'd ever seen, like spring water after a long drought. For a moment, she stared at him with such profound sadness that his own heart seemed to skip a beat. Then recognition flickered across her features, followed by something that looked almost like terror. "No," she whispered, struggling weakly against his hold. "You don't understand. I chose this. I deserve. Nobody deserves to hang from a tree." Jacob interrupted, his voice gruff with emotion he didn't want to examine too closely. "Whatever you think you've done, it ain't worth dying for." He'd been a father once, before fever took his wife and little Sarah 3 winters past. The protective instinct that had lain dormant in his chest suddenly roared to life, fierce and undeniable. This broken woman in his arms awakened something he'd thought buried forever alongside his family in the little cemetery behind his ranch house. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor, and Jacob found himself studying this mysterious woman with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read the subtle signs of danger in every shifting shadow. Her hands, delicate despite their trembling, bore calluses not from farm work, but from hours spent gripping prayer beads. Her fingernails, though dirty now, showed the careful attention of someone unaccustomed to manual labor. "What's your name, sister?" he asked gently, settling her against the base of the oak tree. The irony wasn't lost on him. This tree had nearly been her death, and now it offered shelter. "Sister Mary Catherine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not worthy of that name anymore." Jacob studied her face, noting the way her hands trembled and how she couldn't quite meet his eyes. Whatever had driven her to this desperate act, it was eating her alive from the inside. He'd seen that look before, in his own reflection, right after he'd lost everything that mattered. The same hollow-eyed stare of someone who'd given up on tomorrow. "Well, Sister Mary Catherine," he said, removing his hat and running calloused fingers through his dark hair. "I'm Jacob McCready. This here's my land, and that makes you my responsibility now. At least until you're strong enough to tell me what brought you to my tree." She flinched at the word responsibility, and he filed that reaction away for later consideration. Someone had failed this woman badly, and recently. The way she shrank from his kindness spoke of betrayal by those who should have protected her. "I can't stay," she said, attempting to rise on unsteady legs. "The others, they'll come looking. And when they find me." She swayed dangerously, and Jacob caught her elbow, feeling how thin she'd become beneath the rough fabric of her habit. "Others? What others?" The woman's eyes darted toward the canyon mouth, and Jacob followed her gaze. In the distance, dust clouds were rising, riders, and moving fast. His jaw tightened as he recognized the urgency in their approach. "How long since you escaped?" he asked quietly. 3 days, she whispered. "I've been walking, hiding, trying to find." She gestured weakly at the sign around her neck, trying to find the courage to make it right. Before Jacob could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the canyon. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip as 3 riders emerged from the mesquite brush, their faces hard as flint beneath their wide-brimmed hats. The man in the center, tall and lean with silver at his temples, wore a badge that caught the late afternoon sun. His eyes fixed on Sister Mary Catherine with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey, and Jacob felt his protective instincts sharpen to a razor's edge. "Sheriff Morrison," Jacob nodded, not bothering to hide his wariness. The two men had a history, and none of it good. Morrison had been the one to foreclose on the Henderson place last spring, turning a widow and her 3 children out onto the road. McCready, the sheriff's voice was silk over steel. Seems you found something that belongs to us. I found a woman half dead under my tree, Jacob replied evenly. Last I checked, people don't belong to anybody. Sheriff Morrison's laugh was dry as desert sand. This one does. She's escaped from the territorial prison, where she was being held for the murder of Father Benedict at the San Miguel mission. Strangled him with her own rosary beads, if you can believe such a thing. Jacob felt Sister Mary Catherine stiffen beside him, heard her sharp intake of breath. But when he glanced at her, he saw not guilt in those green eyes, but something far more complex, a mixture of shame, fear, and what looked almost like relief. "That true, sister?" he asked quietly. Her lips parted, trembled, closed again. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, while the sheriff and his men watched with predatory patience. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "I killed him," she whispered. "God help me, I killed him." But even as she spoke the words, Jacob noticed something the sheriff's men had missed. Her hands, small, delicate, marked with ink stains from copying scripture, bore no calluses from manual labor, no scars from a life of violence. And there was something else, something in the way she said it, that made his lawman's instincts twitch. "Well then," Sheriff Morrison said, dismounting with theatrical slowness, "I reckon we'll be taking her back now." "I reckon you won't," Jacob replied, stepping protectively in front of Sister Mary Catherine. "Not without a proper warrant, and not without hearing her story first." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You harboring a fugitive, McCready? Because that's a hanging offense, and you know it." The wind picked up, setting the oak's branches to creaking again, and Jacob could have sworn he heard the echo of that rope still swaying in the breeze. Whatever had driven this woman to attempt such a desperate act, whatever truth lay hidden beneath her confession, he wasn't about to let her disappear into the sheriff's custody without answers. "Maybe I am," he said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Maybe I'm just a man who believes in hearing both sides of a story." But as the sheriff's hand moved toward his own weapon, Jacob realized that some stories might be worth dying for, and some secrets were dangerous enough to kill for. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats before Sheriff Morrison's deputy, a nervous young man with twitchy fingers, shifted his weight in the saddle. The leather creaked like a warning, and Jacob's eyes never left the sheriff's face. "You always were a stubborn fool, McCready," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of old grudges. "But this time, you're backing the wrong horse. That woman's a killer, pure and simple." "Then you won't mind if I hear her confession myself," Jacob replied, his tone steady as granite. Being a God-fearing man and all. Sister Mary Catherine's hand found his sleeve, her touch light as a whisper. "Please," she breathed, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. I've caused enough trouble." Jacob glanced down at her, struck by the genuine concern in her voice. Most fugitives would be begging for protection, but this woman seemed more worried about his safety than her own. It was a peculiar reaction for someone who'd supposedly murdered a priest in cold blood. "Tell me about Father Benedict," he said, quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. Her face went ashen, and she closed her eyes as if trying to block out a painful memory. He was a good man. Or so I thought." Her voice cracked like thin ice. "I trusted him completely. We all did." The sheriff's horse pawed the ground impatiently, and Morrison's jaw tightened. "Enough of this nonsense. Boys, dismount. We're taking her back." But Jacob had caught something in the nun's voice, a tremor that spoke of more than guilt. It spoke of betrayal, of trust shattered so completely that death seemed preferable to living with the truth. "Wait," he said, stepping forward with his hands raised, though his right remained close to his gun. "Sister, look at me." Those green eyes opened, swimming with unshed tears. "Did you kill Father Benedict with your own hands?" he asked. The question hung in the desert air like smoke. The sheriff's men exchanged glances, clearly expecting a simple confirmation. But Sister Mary Catherine's response was anything but simple. "Ah, yes. No. I." She pressed her palms against her temples, her whole body trembling. "I can't think straight anymore. The guilt, the shame, it's eating me alive." That's not an answer, sister. It's the only answer I have, she cried, her voice breaking completely. I killed him as surely as if I'd put my hands around his throat. My weakness, my sin, it drove him to madness, and he died because of it. Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard enough confessions from dying men to recognize the difference between guilt and responsibility. This woman wasn't confessing to murder. She was confessing to being human. "What did he do to you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The sheriff's laugh was harsh. "Oh, that's rich. You think this is about some imagined slight? Father Benedict was a saint, Macready. He ran that mission with an iron fist, kept those Apache raids at bay, and brought order to that godforsaken place. If anyone was wronged, it was him." But Jacob was watching Sister Mary Catherine's face, and he saw her flinch at the word saint. Her hands moved unconsciously to her throat, and he noticed for the first time the faint marks there. Old bruises, nearly healed but still visible to a careful observer. "You said he was a good man," Jacob said gently. "What changed your mind?" "He was supposed to be my spiritual father," she whispered. "I came to him for guidance, for confession. I told him about the doubts I'd been having, about feeling lost in my faith. And he said he could help me find my way back to God." The pieces were starting to fall into place, and Jacob felt a familiar rage building in his chest. The same fury that had consumed him when he'd found his neighbor beating his wife behind the barn 2 summers ago. "How did he help you, sister?" "He said my body was keeping me from true spiritual union with the Lord, that I needed to be purified, made clean." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He said it was God's will." The sheriff's face remained impassive, but Jacob caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Morrison knew. He'd known all along what kind of man Father Benedict really was. "And when you tried to refuse?" Jacob asked. "He said I was weak, that my resistance proved how deeply sin had taken root in my heart. He said," she swallowed hard, her voice failing. "He said what? That if I truly loved God, I would submit without question, that my suffering would wash away my sins and make me worthy of heaven." Jacob's hand moved to his gun without conscious thought. "How long did this go on?" "Months. I kept thinking it would get better, that I was being tested. But then other sisters started coming to me, whispering about their own sessions with Father Benedict. And I realized." She looked up at him with eyes full of anguish. "I realized we were all trapped in his web of lies." "So you killed him," Morrison said flatly. "Case closed." "No." Sister Mary Catherine shook her head. "I tried to expose him. I wrote letters to the bishop, to the territorial authorities. But Father Benedict found out. He said I was possessed by demons, that I was spreading lies to corrupt the other sisters. He locked me in the bell tower for 3 days without food or water, saying prayer and fasting would drive the evil from my soul." Jacob's blood was running cold. "What happened next?" "I escaped, climbed down the bell rope and ran. But he came after me, and when he found me," she touched her throat again, "he said I'd left him no choice, that he had to silence me before I destroyed his holy work. And we fought. He was stronger, but I was desperate. When he grabbed me, She held up her hands, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. "I pushed him away as hard as I could. He stumbled backward, hit his head on the altar. Stone. There was so much blood. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the sheriff's horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He was still alive when I left," she continued, breathing, conscious. "I could have helped him, could have called for aid. But I ran. I was so afraid, so ashamed. And by the time they found him, he was dead," Morrison finished. "Died from his injuries 2 days later." Sister Mary Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I killed him with my cowardice. If I'd stayed, if I'd been braver, he might still be alive." Jacob holstered his gun and knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Sister, what you did wasn't murder. It was self-defense. The law says otherwise," Morrison interjected. "She fled the scene of a crime, left a man to die. That's murder in my book." But Jacob was studying the sheriff's face, noting the way he avoided looking directly at Sister Mary Catherine. "Tell me, Morrison, how long did you know what Father Benedict was doing to those women?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. You knew, and you did nothing. Because he was useful to you, wasn't he? Kept the peace, brought in donations from back east. What's a few ruined lives compared to that? Morrison's hand dropped to his gun, and Jacob realized they'd moved far beyond a simple arrest. They were standing at the edge of a conspiracy that reached deeper than he'd ever imagined. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and secrets. As Sheriff Morrison's face hardened into something ugly and familiar. Jacob had seen that look before, on the faces of men who'd sold their souls so long ago they'd forgotten what honor felt like. "You're walking on dangerous ground, McCready," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Father Benedict was a pillar of this community. You start spreading lies about him, and you'll find yourself in more trouble than you can handle." Lies. Jacob stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Sister, tell me about the other women. The ones who whispered to you." Sister Mary Catherine's face went pale as winter moonlight. Sister Agnes was the first to speak. She'd been at the mission for 5 years, came from a convent in Santa Fe. She said Father Benedict had been counseling her for spiritual weaknesses, teaching her about submission to God's will through. She couldn't finish the sentence. "Through what?" Jacob pressed gently. "Through acts that no holy man should demand of any woman," she whispered. Sister Maria Elena was next. She was barely 18, had come to us seeking sanctuary from a cruel father. Father Benedict told her she needed to learn proper obedience to male authority. He said it was God's plan for women to suffer for Eve's sin. The sheriff's deputy shifted nervously in his saddle, and Jacob caught the young man's eye. There was something there, a flicker of recognition, of guilt barely contained. "How many?" Jacob asked. "7 of us, in the end. We started meeting in secret, sharing our stories, trying to understand why God would allow such things to happen in his house. But Father Benedict discovered our gatherings. He said we were forming a coven, practicing witchcraft." Morrison's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "And you believed him? A man of God, reduced to lies and accusations by a bunch of hysterical women." "I believed him because I wanted to," Sister Mary Catherine replied, her voice gaining strength. "Because believing his version meant I didn't have to face the truth about what he was, what he'd made me complicit in through my silence." Jacob felt the pieces clicking together like bullets sliding into a chamber. "The night he died, he didn't come after you alone, did he?" She shook her head. "He brought 2 men with him. Said he'd hired them to bring me back to face church justice. But when they found me by the river, washing my clothes," she shuddered. "The things they said, the way they looked at me, I realized Father Benedict had told them I was already fallen, already soiled. He'd given them permission to do whatever they wanted." "Who were these men?" Jacob's voice was deadly quiet. Sister Mary Catherine's eyes moved to the sheriff's deputy, and the young man's face went crimson. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what kind of man he really was." Deputy Hayes, Morrison, snapped. "Keep your mouth shut." But the dam had broken. "She's telling the truth, Sheriff. About that night, about what Father Benedict hired us to do. He said she was a fallen woman, that she'd seduced him and then tried to destroy his reputation. When he rejected her advances, he said we could have our way with her before bringing her back." Jacob's hand moved to his gun, and this time he didn't try to hide the motion. "And you believed him?" "I wanted to," Hayes said miserably. "The money he offered, it was more than I'd see in 6 months of deputy work. But when we cornered her by the river, and she looked at us with those eyes," he shook his head. "I couldn't do it. I told Father Benedict the first was backing out." "But your partner wasn't so squeamish," Jacob said. "Tom Brennan," Hayes whispered. "He said a job was a job, and he'd been paid to bring her back by any means necessary. When she ran, he went after her. I heard them fighting, heard her screaming for help. By the time you got there, she'd killed them both." Morrison finished coldly. "Self-defense or not, that's 2 dead men, Hayes. 2 men whose families deserve justice." "No," Hayes said, his voice breaking. "Tom was alive when I found him. Unconscious, but breathing. Father Benedict too. But Tom, he was furious. Said the woman had made fools of us all, that she needed to be taught a lesson. He was going to go after her again, finish what he'd started." Jacob felt Sister Mary Catherine's hand grip his arm. "I didn't kill Tom Brennan," she whispered. "I swear on my mother's grave, I never even saw him after I pushed Father Benedict away from me." Then who did? Jacob asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Hayes looked at Sheriff Morrison with eyes full of anguish. Tell him, Sheriff. Tell him what really happened that night. Morrison's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady. I don't know what you're talking about, boy. You're letting this woman's lies twist your memory. I'm not lying, Hayes said desperately. You were there, Sheriff. You came looking for us when we didn't return by midnight. You found Tom trying to force himself on her while she was unconscious. You said you couldn't let him destroy everything you'd built. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Jacob stared at the sheriff, seeing him clearly for the first time. You killed Tom Brennan, and then you let Father Benedict die while you concocted this story about a murderous nun. Tom was a liability, Morrison said quietly. A drunkard, a brute who couldn't follow simple orders. If he'd raped that woman, word would have gotten out. The territorial governor was already asking questions about Father Benedict's methods. One scandal would have brought down everything. Everything? Jacob asked. What everything? Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. You think a backwater sheriff makes enough money to buy 3 sections of prime grazing land? You think a simple mission priest could afford to send regular payments to politicians in Santa Fe? Father Benedict and I had an arrangement. He kept the peace with the Apache. I kept the territorial authorities from looking too closely at his methods. We split the profits from the land grants and the federal subsidies. Sister Mary Catherine stared at him in horror. You knew what he was doing to us. You knew, and you protected him. I protected order, Morrison replied. Civilization in a wild land. A few hysterical women seemed a small price to pay for keeping this territory from descending into chaos. The wind picked up, setting the oak's branches to creaking again, and Jacob could almost hear the echo of that rope. The rope that had driven this broken woman to attempt ending her own life rather than live with the weight of shame that belonged to other men. But Father Benedict got greedy. Jacob continued, the whole ugly picture becoming clear. He started taking bigger risks, didn't he? Started attracting attention you couldn't cover up. He was becoming unstable, Morrison admitted. Talking about divine visions, about expanding his mission to other territories. He'd outlived his usefulness. So you let him die. I let nature take its course. And I let this woman take the blame for cleaning up a mess that was threatening to destroy everything we'd built. But as Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, Jacob realized that some secrets were worth killing for, and some men would burn the world down rather than face the consequences of their own sins. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. For men and one woman frozen in a tableau of betrayal and revelation. Then Morrison's gun cleared leather, and the desert exploded into violence. Jacob threw himself sideways, tackling Sister Mary Catherine to the ground as the sheriff's bullet whined past their heads and splinked into the oak's gnarled trunk. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with dust and the metallic taste of fear. Hayes, Morrison barked. Do your duty. But the young deputy sat paralyzed in his saddle, his weapon still holstered, his face a mask of conflicted loyalty. The third man, a hard-faced stranger Jacob didn't recognize, had already drawn his gun and was taking aim at the pair huddled behind the tree. Jacob rolled, came up with his Colt in hand, and put a bullet through the stranger's shoulder. The man screamed and toppled from his horse, his gun spinning away into the sagebrush. The riderless horse reared and bolted, its hoofbeats echoing across the canyon like thunder. This ends now, Morrison, Jacob called out, keeping the oak between himself and the sheriff. You've got nowhere to run. Morrison's laugh was wild, unhinged. Run? Boy, you don't understand what you're dealing with. I've got friends in Santa Fe, in Washington. This whole territory belongs to men like me. You kill me, and you'll have the territorial marshal down here before the week's out. Maybe, Jacob admitted, checking his ammunition. But you'll still be dead. Sister Mary Catherine pressed herself against the tree trunk, her breathing shallow and rapid. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never meant for this to happen. I should have kept quiet. No, Jacob said firmly, never taking his eyes off Morrison's position. You should have spoken up sooner. Those other women, they deserved better than silence. The other women are dead, Morrison called out, his voice carrying a cruel satisfaction. Funny how many accidents can befall young ladies who talk too much. A fall from the bell tower here, a riding accident there. The Lord works in mysterious Ways. Jacob felt ice form in his veins. You killed them all. I protected the natural order, Morrison replied. Father Benedict was getting sloppy, leaving too many loose ends. I simply tied them up. The admission hung in the air like a curse. Sister Mary Catherine made a sound like a wounded animal, and Jacob saw her hands clench into fists. The woman who had tried to hang herself from this very tree was transforming before his eyes, grief and rage burning away her guilt like fire through dry grass. Hayes, Morrison called again. If you don't draw that gun right now, I'll make sure. Everyone knows you were part of this from the beginning. Your wife, your children, they'll bear the shame of your cowardice forever. The young deputy's face crumpled, and Jacob saw him reach for his weapon with trembling hands. But before Hayes could clear leather, a new voice cut through the tension. I wouldn't do that if I were you, son. Jacob turned to see an elderly Mexican man emerging from the brush, an ancient but well-maintained rifle cradled in his arms. Behind him came two more men, their faces weathered by sun and hardship, but their eyes sharp with purpose. Diego, Jacob breathed, recognizing his neighbor. What are you doing here? Following the sound of gunfire, Diego replied, his accented English measured and calm. Also following rumors about missing women and corrupt lawmen. We've been watching Sheriff Morrison for months, waiting for him to make a mistake. Morrison's face went pale. You have no authority here, old man. Perhaps not, Diego agreed. But I have this. He raised a folded paper. A warrant from the territorial marshal, charging Sheriff Morrison with conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal statutes regarding the treatment of religious persons. Seems someone in Santa Fe finally decided to investigate those missing women. Jacob felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. Morrison's eyes had gone wild, and he was backing toward his horse with his gun still drawn. You're all lying, the sheriff snarled. This is a conspiracy, a plot to destroy good Christian men who've devoted their lives to bringing order to this godless land. The only conspiracy here is the one you created, Diego replied, with greed and corruption and the blood of innocent women. Morrison reached his horse and swung into the saddle, keeping his gun trained on the group. This isn't over, he said. I'll be back with federal marshals, with territorial militia if necessary. And when I return, I'll hang every one of you for interfering with the law. But as he wheeled his horse around, Sister Mary Catherine stepped out from behind the oak tree. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady as stone. Sheriff Morrison, she called. The sheriff turned, his gun swinging toward her. You've caused enough trouble, woman. Time to pay for your sins. Yes, she said simply. It is. The rosary beads in her hands caught the afternoon light as she began to pray, her voice carrying across the canyon with surprising strength. But these weren't prayers for mercy or forgiveness. They were prayers for justice, for the souls of the women who had died in silence, for the courage to speak truth in the face of power. Morrison's face twisted with rage. Shut up, he screamed. I won't listen to your lies and blasphemy. But Sister Mary Catherine continued praying, and her words seemed to rob the sheriff of his strength. His gun hand began to shake, and Jacob saw something break behind his eyes, the last vestige of the authority he'd wielded for so long. You want to know the truth? Morrison shouted, his voice cracking. Fine, I'll tell you the truth. Father Benedict was a monster, but he was my monster. He kept the peace, brought in money, made this territory profitable. Those women were a price worth paying for civilization. The confession echoed across the canyon, and Jacob saw Hayes finally draw his gun, not to support his sheriff, but to aim it at him. That's enough, the young deputy said, his voice thick with shame. Sheriff Morrison, I'm placing you under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. Morrison stared at his former deputy as if seeing him for the first time. You fool, he whispered. You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, Hayes replied. I've finally remembered what it means to be a lawman. The sheriff's shoulders sagged, and for a moment Jacob thought he might surrender. But then Morrison's eyes hardened one last time, and he raised his gun towards Sister Mary Catherine. If I'm going to hang, he said, I'm taking this lying whore with me. The shot rang out across the canyon, echoing off the distant mesas like the voice of God himself. But it wasn't Morrison who fired, it was Jacob, and his bullet flew true, but in the settling dust and gun smoke, he couldn't tell if he'd been fast enough to save the woman who'd already saved herself by finally speaking the truth. The gun smoke cleared like a prayer answered, revealing Sheriff Morrison slumped in his saddle, Jacob's bullet having found its mark in the man's gun arm. Morrison's weapon lay in the dust, and the sheriff himself swayed like a man awakening from a long, dark dream. Sister Mary Catherine stood untouched, her rosary beads still clutched in her hands, her face wet with tears that seemed to wash away years of accumulated shame. The wooden sign that had hung around her neck lay broken at her feet, split clean through by a fragment from Morrison's wild shot. "It's over," Jacob said quietly, his smoking gun still trained on the sheriff. "It's finally over." Deputy Hayes dismounted and approached his former superior with shaking hands, pulling iron shackles from his saddlebags. "Sheriff Morrison, by the authority of the territorial marshal, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and corruption of office." Morrison laughed bitterly as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You think this changes anything? You think one corrupt sheriff and one dead priest will clean up this whole territory? There are a dozen men like me, 100 like Father Benedict. We're just the ones who got caught." "Maybe," Diego said, helping the wounded stranger to his feet. "But every journey begins with a single step, and every corruption ends with someone brave enough to speak the truth." He nodded towards Sister Mary Catherine, who was kneeling beside the broken sign, running her fingers over the splintered wood. The words, "God won't forgive," were still visible, but the rest had been obliterated, leaving only a fragment of self-condemnation that no longer seemed to hold any power over her. "Sister," Jacob said gently, holstering his gun and approaching her, "are you hurt?" She looked up at him with those clear green eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her hanging from the oak tree, he saw something other than despair looking back at him. "I don't think I am Sister Mary Catherine anymore," she said softly. I think I might just be Catherine now." "Catherine," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It suited her, simple, honest, unadorned by titles or expectations. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her torn habit. "I need to go back to the mission. There are things to be set right, testimony to be given. The other missions in the territory. If there are women there suffering what we suffered." "You don't have to do this alone," Jacob said. "I'll ride with you." "We all will," Diego added. "This corruption runs deep, but so does the desire for justice. There are good people in this territory, people who've been waiting for someone brave enough to speak up." Hayes finished securing Morrison to his horse and turned to face the group. "I'll need statements from all of you. And sister, Catherine, I'll need you to identify the graves of the women who died. They deserve proper burial, proper recognition." Catherine nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to her throat where the faint bruises were already fading. "They were good women. They deserved so much better than silence." "They'll have their justice now," Jacob assured her. "Their stories will be told." As if summoned by his words, a warm breeze stirred the sagebrush, carrying with it the faint scent of desert wildflowers, blooms that appeared only after the rarest of rains, bringing sudden color to a landscape that seemed too harsh to support. Such beauty. Catherine noticed them too, these small purple and yellow blossoms that had pushed through the hard-pan earth overnight. She knelt and touched one gently, a wonder in her voice that Jacob hadn't heard before. "I used to think the desert was barren," she said. "Dead, incapable of producing anything beautiful. But I was wrong, wasn't I? Life finds a way, even in the hardest ground." Jacob knelt beside her, his calloused rancher's hands surprisingly gentle, as he helped her to her feet. "My wife used to say that the most beautiful flowers are the ones that grow in impossible places. Takes more strength to bloom in the desert than it does in a garden." Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. And she would have liked you, I think. Both of you knew something about finding strength in dark places. They stood together in the shade of the oak tree, the same tree that had nearly claimed Catherine's life, now offering shelter and the promise of new beginnings. The rope was gone, cut away and burned, but the tree itself remained, scarred but alive, its roots running deep into the unforgiving earth. "What will you do now?" Jacob asked. "When this is all settled, when the testimony is given and the graves are marked?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossible in a land so harsh. I don't know, she admitted. For so long, my life was defined by the church, by rules and vows and other people's expectations. I'm not sure I know how to be just. Catherine. Well, Jacob said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised them both. If you need some time to figure that out, my ranch could use a woman's touch. Been too long since there was laughter in that house. Too long since someone who understood about healing from hard things. She looked at him then, really looked, seeing past the weathered exterior to the gentle heart beneath. Are you asking me to stay, Mr. McCready? I'm asking you to consider it, he replied. No promises, no obligations. Just possibility. Hey, chance to see what might grow if you give it time and care. The smile that spread across Catherine's face was like sunrise after the longest night. I think I'd like that very much. As they prepared to leave, Morrison secured and ready for transport, the wounded stranger patched up and grateful to be alive. Hayes already composing his report in his head. Catherine took one last look at the oak tree where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The broken sign lay forgotten in the dust, its message of despair already being scattered by the desert wind. In its place, the small wildflowers continued their impossible bloom, proving that even in the hardest ground, with enough courage and care, beautiful things could grow. Friends, if this tale of courage in dark places has stirred your heart, I'd be much obliged if you'd give it a like and share your thoughts below. Sometimes the strongest among us are the ones who've learned to bloom in the desert. Now tell me, where are you watching from today? Whether you're in the heart of Texas or clear across the world, drop a comment and let us know where this story found you.